Welcome to the Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jerad Alexander. Jerad served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1998 to 2006. He grew up in a military base from the East Coast to Japan, and he has written for Squire, Rolling Stone, The Nation, and a few others. He holds an MFA in literary reportage, and today we will speak about his book, Volunteer, Growing Up in the Forever War. Jared, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So it's very nice to have a perspective of the war from someone who has been there. And from looking at you, from reading your book, this is nothing new. I mean, you grew up in a military base and you come from a lineage of people who have been serving in the military for several generations. I wonder if we could start there and tell us a little bit about your family background, how far back in history you guys have been serving for the military.
Well, sure. My family, it goes, on the Alexander side of things. From what I was able to research and come to learn, is that it goes back as far as the American Revolution. Um, I've had my dad was in the military. My stepfather was in the military. My mother, every single grandfather was in the military, including step grandparents. Um, so not only was my own localized experience surrounded by the military, but it was also sort of a generational thing. Every set of offspring, somebody ends up in the military. My mother was also in the Air Force, so it goes back as far as the revolution is on one side, and then on the other, there is some involvement with the British military as well.
So do you feel that that was your only path? What would it feel like if maybe in such a lineage of military service, you would have told your parents, Mom, Dad, I want to be a writer, or I don't know, an architect, or anything other than being a serviceman?
I think that my family would have been very supportive of anything that I had chosen, as long as I put my full effort to it. I didn't have to go into the military. It wasn't really a familial obligation. But because I was surrounded by it so much, going a different direction was a harder choice than not. It was just, I was around it so much and I was so influenced by it that it was hard for anything else to take hold. Now, I had interest in writing as a teenager, but I had no examples from which to draw from. And, authors tend to be a little bit hazy and esoteric in that way. And so it was just the best examples I had of what joining the military was the best example I had of what I could do with myself. It was also very much part of my interest. I was around it so much that it was just part of like my background and my backdrop, and that influenced how I saw the world and how I wanted to see myself in it.
When I was a little kid, I was kind of a rebellious little kid. And as a punishment, my parents put me in a military school. And I spent a few years there. And when I was there, me too, I wanted to be part of the military. And, I got a liking to playing with guns and playing these war games in the woods and this and that becomes that infiltrates little by little into the things that you would like to do, and everything else becomes almost obfuscated.
It really does. Yeah. I mean, it becomes something that, it's like any interest. Once you get surrounded by it and you sort of take it and adopt it as your own, it kind of becomes a world in which you see excuse me, it becomes a lens with which you see the world. Especially as a teenager, I think that that's really true. I think that, or as a kid, you kind of tend to latch onto things somewhat obsessively to a certain extent. And I did that with my interest, like in Vietnam, for example. I was really fascinated with it, and I was surprised. It's good to hear that you were interested in it too, because I think that sometimes going to a military academy will seem obligatory, and because it's obligatory, it has a sense of, it feels somewhat imprisoning. It can feel somewhat shackling because a kid is being sent there for a disciplinary reason, and so it becomes the intended effect is the exact opposite. It becomes this sort of animal that they have to overcome. But for me, it was something to aspire to. The military, and And that was because of the way that I interacted with it as a kid.
And so when you were a kid, were you imagining to be some kind of war hero that goes and saves the country or defended against the evil, I don't know, the evil communists or the evil Muslims or whoever happens to be the enemy of the time?
I don't think I had any interest in being a heroic individual. Or at least not like I had no inclinations of winning medals or any of that. That wasn't really something that I thought much about. It was more just being, it was more or less just being involved in the story of a war that was going on. It was just being present to it and witness to it. As far as being a protector of, some against some force, there's a little bit of that I think in play. But I also was kind of, as a teenager especially, I was conscious enough to know that who we were fighting was somewhat irrelevant, and that the reasons we would fight a war were not always perhaps the cleanest, and certainly not something to be, like the hagiography of World War II loomed large over our experience. But at the same time, I knew that wasn't always going to be the case. And so I think I was more interested in just having the experience of being in the military, and probably, and also having the experience of going into a combat zone, than I was fulfilling some sort of larger noble idea of what I was doing. Now, I hope that was going to be the case for the service that I was in, and to a large degree, I tended to lean toward that, but I didn't expect that to be an assumed norm.
Right. Okay. So the title of the book is what is it? Growing Up in the Forever War. And it seems like the United States have been in this war that it just smelled from one into the other. Like we just spent 20 years in Afghanistan, for example. And many people seem indifferent or maybe even unaware that there are Americans dying in this foreign soil. And I wonder why is there such a disconnect from the reality of the soldier there in the mud, or waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning with a gun in their hand, to the consumer in the United States who is unaware that that's happening. While at the same time, for someone in Afghanistan, that's a real everyday reality.
Well, I think Americans, we don't have a connection to the soldier as the way we used to. And that's by virtue of the fact that there's not as many as there was. So if you look at the Second World War, millions of Americans fought in that conflict, and it dominated our culture for, the time that we were involved in it, from 41 to 45, more like 42 to 45, really just those 3 years. And, obviously it dominated the world for a lot longer than that, but it only mattered to us when we were involved in it. But people can make a connection to the soldiers they fought in, because the soldiers of the wars, the soldiers that fought in the wars, because they had brothers who were soldiers, they had mothers who worked in the factories to provide arms, they had cousins and brothers and husbands who all fought in that war, and so they can make a literal connection to the conflicts. Well, now the military is a very, very small percentage of our population. It's really narrow. And also people aren't drafted anymore. It's non-obligatory. It's all volunteer force. And so people don't have a need. They don't have a need. There's no political and social need to be connected to the wars that our countries are fighting in. And so it's easy to dismiss it. Politics are local, right? I mean, we tend to view politics in a very local way, things that happen around us, things that happen to people around us. And if those things don't involve people who are fighting in wars or people who are being affected by them, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. The audience just simply isn't there for the wars anymore, because there's no connection to be made between an audience and the subject.
Right. Okay. So the American military is mostly composed of volunteers, and it's a small percentage of people who are serving. To what extent the soldiers, the men and women who put on a uniform, are doing it out of sense of patriotism, and to what extent is it out of economic necessity? I mean, I have read reports that many people join the military because they just don't have any ways to make ends meet.
Okay, that's actually an inaccurate statement. if you look at I'd have to dig it up, but there was a great great graph that looked at the volume of people in the military based on their economic status before they enlisted. And the two smallest groups are the guys on the people that come from extreme poverty and extreme wealth. Those are the smallest percentage of people who enlist in the military come from those economic categories. The large percentage of the military comes from the middle class. And so that means that these are people who they don't have excessive amounts of means, but they have some. But they have elected to enlist in the military for one reason or another. So that means that there's two things at play there. One, it's on the poverty side, it's their qualifications to enlist. That's at play there. So they may not be able to enlist in the military because they're unqualified to do so, either by virtue of an education or they've gotten involved in something that makes it difficult for them to enlist on perhaps on a criminal justice level or something to that end. But it takes a little bit more than just an economic hard economic straits to want to go into the military. I mean, they're people enlist for a lot of different reasons, and economics is probably not very high on that list. They enlist for a lot of other reasons. They enlist partly out of patriotism. I think there's an element of that, but I also think it's adventurism. There's just a simple adventurism in enlisting. It's also sort of grabbing on to a more exciting life in general terms. If I grew up in a suburb of America, it can probably look very sedate, and the military can look as an antidote to that. And so I think a lot of folks enlist on that front. There are also technical pathways there as well. They enlist for job skills to a certain extent too. That's a big part of the reasons why they go to the military, to learn how to do something in a different field, or to acquire a skill, or acquire the GI Bill, so when they get out they can go to college for free, and avoid the debt. And so those are more common reasons than they just are simply poor, or can't afford to live and thus want to go into the military.
Wow, I am so full of gratitude for you pointing that out, because the way that I read the media nowadays, I have been tend to believe that it's out of economic despair that a lot of people join the military. So from someone, that's the benefit of speaking to someone like you who has been in the ground and can see around, rather than someone pushing an agenda. So I'm grateful for that observation. Let me ask you, how did the Marines feel, or people serving, let's say in Iraq, how did they feel when they discovered that they were not weapons of mass destruction, and that they were there out of some either political or economical reasons and not really a security reason?
Well, I think that a lot of we didn't have a lot of conversations about that at the lower level, and the reason is because we have no way to influence those decisions. So there's a tendency to compartmentalize. Like, look, a Marine is responsible for the last 1,000 yards of American foreign policy, effectively, and so within those 1,000 yards, policy, it doesn't really apply to them. Well, I shouldn't say it doesn't apply. It does, obviously, but they don't have any agency of changing the policies that put them into that position. So their issues are more local, very much like, how do I get my squad from the start of a deployment to the end of one all alive, or, how do I handle this job while I'm doing this thing. Now, that said, there were some conversations about it. I think that, I knew that, the lead up to the Iraq War in particular, there was a lot of sort of in between ground. There was a lot of I had a lot of Marines who said, well, they defaulted to the typical lines of, well, we were attacked and therefore we need to deal justice with terrorists across the world. I heard a lot of those voices, certainly, and then I heard a smaller subset say, look, I don't know what we're doing this for exactly. I had a very good friend of mine. In fact, he said, while we were there, he was a veteran of Afghanistan. He had been wounded there, and he said, look, I understand what Afghanistan was about. And this is in 2005. He was there in 2004. And he's like, I understood what Afghanistan was about in general terms, but I have no idea what we're doing here. And I feel kind of weird about that. And he is still in the Marine Corps to this day, mind you. He is an actively serving member of the Marine Corps today. And so, the politics of that didn't wedge him away from the basic ideas of service. So the policies that put us there were sort of secondary to the job at hand. And that was sort of the marker of the professionalism.
And okay, but coming back, I mean, and for example, now you are not longer a member of the military. Do you feel, upon reflecting, like, wow, we were lied to?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The American people were sold a bill of goods as it relates to the Iraq War. But I'll have to tell you that I don't know that it would have had much of an impact if they were told the truth about it either. I'm not
Wow,
certain that that war would have been avoided.
you are completely right. Okay, well, you served 8 years there. Finally, what was the decision to quit?
Well, I just did all I need. I did all I wanted to do. I was reaching a point in my time in the Marine Corps where I had to make some decisions about what my future was going to be. When you hit the 10, when you get close to the 10-year mark, it doesn't make a lot of sense to leave unless you're sort of forced out by one reason or another. You kind of want to stick around for 20 years and retire because you've already put in that much time. You might as well stay around. But I also didn't want to be in the enlisted ranks at a higher level. I didn't have a very good taste in my mouth about what that experience was going to be like. It was validated later by listening to other people who did, and so I just felt like I accomplished what I wanted, and just felt that I wanted to go on to do something else. And I'm grateful for that. I'm glad I did. I'd become a little bit jaded with the service, and I just kind of wanted to move on.
Right. Okay. And so now you have a new life. You written a book. You write for the Squire, for the Rolling Stone, the Nation, and you just told us not too long ago that you like writing. Can you tell us about this new life decision that you took? You stopped serving the military, and then what? How did this turn out to be the way that you live your life?
Well, I got, a lot of it is a lot of luck and a little perseverance. I mean, you know, I started writing. I've been writing, I was a writer in the Marine Corps for a certain amount of time. And then I kind of needed to relearn how to do it. And so I got out of the military and I just started writing, as best, as much as I could and reading as much as I could, and then sort of unraveling what it all meant to do that kind of job. And then, I had a job at the time that allowed me a lot of opportunity to sort of write on my own. And I just and as I got older and a little bit more disciplined, I leaned into it even harder and pursued it really dogmatically. And now I try not to do a day without doing something in the written word, or at least reading it. I'm always engaged with it. And so, yeah, that's, it's just a lot of, I mean, if I were going to tell anybody who wants to get into this field, expect a lot of rejection, but also know that you got to put your full weight behind it. It takes a lot of effort to do this and to do it at least halfway well.
Well, I feel that in many ways, and we talked about this already, Americans are a little bit disengaged about their political struggles overseas. And it's just good to find out what is it like for people like you who have to put on a uniform and risk their life to defend the idea of their country. So I wonder if there is any other than reading books like yours. Is there any other ways in which Americans could become more aware of the reality of war?
Well, I think that they need to get involved with the foreign policy of the country, of our country, of the United States. I think that they need to engage. They need to, read works and read. There's great journalism out there about wars abroad. I mean, there's some really good people doing a lot of really good work. And I think that they just need to engage with that a little bit more. And then they need to ask their elected leaders questions about why we're doing the things that we're doing, and make that part of their political consciousness. It takes effort to do that, especially when you're not obligated to do it. And so that's what, what we're effectively asking Americans is to engage more. Now, that's hard because we've got a lot of things on our plate and we're kind of left twisting in the winds in a lot of ways politically. And so asking them to engage or to participate with the foreign policy of this country is somewhat of a difficult ask, considering how miasmic and just how complex it is. But I think that that's what I would ask the average American to do is not only take responsibility of the domestic issues of the country, our economics, our general welfare and that sort of thing, but also understand that how our foreign policy plays out affects those things. The way we engage overseas determines in a lot of ways how we operate inside our own borders. And a lot of folks were, like, for example, a lot of folks are upset over illegal immigration. Well, illegal immigration is in part driven by our policies abroad, right? Our policies in Central and South America are not the best, and they have forced a migrant problem onto the United States. So those two things are interrelated. And so if you can engage with one, you can understand the other. Migrant problems in general terms across the world are a result of the wars in the Middle East. We think of the Syrian refugee crisis. Well, that comes from the Syrian civil war and then our involvement in that. If we can understand both one, we can understand the other. And that's something that I think that folks ought to consider.
Well, it's nice to be able to see the big picture after, of course, reflecting upon these foreign policies for a number of years, like you have done. But how can the average American be informed of things going on without falling victim of one branch of propaganda as opposed to the other? Because if you, let's say you start reading or listening to news from one TV channel, then all of a sudden you become part of this gang, and then I obfuscate whatever the people who have a different opinion has to say, and this is the correct thing to do, whether it's invading another country or I don't know, having harsh immigration policies.
Well, information needs to be aggregated, and it doesn't need to be siloed. And so what I would recommend anyone do is take in information from a wide stream of sources, not just from a few, including, one of the things that I really like, I try to push, or at least I'm an advocate for, is listening to viewpoints that differ from your own. And that can be tough to do, especially now. We really find that a struggle. Especially when sometimes those views are inherently deleterious to our belief systems. But engaging with a wide, you're absolutely right that there's a tendency to, if we lock into one news channel or one newspaper or one set of podcasts, or we're going to get a very, very filtered and very myopic set of information, set of facts. So we're going to get a set of facts that are actually facts. They're going to be tailored to fit the polemic of the individual that's presenting them. But if we take in a wide stream of them, those views are now responsible for contrasting and clashing with each other. And then we can kind of come to the middle a little bit better. So as far as like understanding our foreign policy, I do think that like I think of Osmet Khan, who's been doing great reporting on, bomb strikes in the Middle East and errant bombing missions and that sort of thing, and looking at civilian casualties that have been brought on by the United States in Afghanistan and in the Middle East at large. And, I think that person's done an incredible job in reporting that. So it does exist. I think she writes for the New York Times Magazine, I believe is what it is. But there are really good reporters doing really good work. It just takes a little bit of effort to find that. And it's out there, it's available, and it's easily found. It's just people got to do the work. You got to do the work.
Well, Jerad, thank you
so much.
It's
complicated.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It really is refreshing. I read the story from someone who lived the experience and not someone who is trying to push an agenda either from one side or the other. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing right now?
Well, thanks. So the book is called Volunteers Growing Up in the Forever War. If they would like to find me, I can be reached at Twitter at Jerad_Alexander. I'm also available on Instagram. I have a website, JeradAlexander.com. You can find the links to those there.
Jerad, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.